In this video, we're going to cover both the urinary system and the male reproductive system. They, at first glance, seem odd. The urinary system is going to be the same for males and females. In the males, the urinary system shares plumbing, or part of its plumbing, with the male reproductive system, which is why they were put together into this one chapter. But what we learn about the urinary system here holds for males and females. Then when we get to the male reproductive system, that's just the male reproductive system. In the next video, the last video, will be the female reproductive system. So as usual, I'm going to cover the function and anatomy of the urinary system and then the word parts of the urinary system. Then I'll talk about the function and anatomy of the male reproductive system, then the word parts specific to the male reproductive system. Functions of the urinary system are several-fold. Excretion of metabolic waste is clearly its day job. That's really what it's there for. And in terms of metabolic waste, we're talking about usually waste that contains nitrogen, like urea and uric acid and creatinine. Urea, uric acid, and creatinine. You're going to see some of those words in the terminology in the rest of the chapter that you're going to be responsible for. So those are the main metabolic waste, but also things like the breakdown products of any medicine that you take is going to be excreted through the urinary system. They also play a role in maintaining the balance of electrolytes. That's things like sodium and potassium and calcium in the body, and that's closely tied to controlling the amount of water in the body, or hydration state. If you're not taking in a lot of water, your kidneys will make a more concentrated, lower volume of urine. If you've got plenty of water around, you're drinking water all day, then your kidneys will produce a more dilute, higher volume of urine. So how much water you have as a total inside the body is one of the main factors in maintaining blood pressure. Then finally, as another function, the pH of the body, how acidic or how basic the body is ultimately controlled by the kidneys. Kidneys also secrete some hormones. So here is the macroscopic anatomy, the plumbing of the kidneys. The kidneys themselves, the left sits a little higher than the right, just under those last few floating ribs of the rib cage. And they're responsible for actually making the urine and filtering the blood. Once the urine is made, it flows out of the kidney and into the ureters, and one for each kidney, that both lead down to the bladder. The bladder is just a storage site. Nothing really happens there. It just stores the urine until you're at the appropriate time and place to get rid of it, at which point the urine will flow down through the urethra and out of the body. This is really the only thing that's different in male urinary system than the female, is that the urethra is much longer in the male because it has to extend through the penis. Also, females don't have this gland. This is a prostate gland, which we will talk about when we get to the reproductive side of the males. So let's take a closer look at what's going on inside the kidney. The functional units of the kidney, the anatomy that actually makes the urine, are called nephrons. And each kidney has millions of nephrons, and you really only need one kidney. You could survive just fine on one kidney. There's plenty of nephrons in one kidney to clear enough of the waste out of the blood to keep you healthy. Each nephron consists of a capillary bed called the glomerulus. Glomerulus. Fluid leaks out of the glomerulus and is collected into a tube, and as that fluid flows through the tube, its composition is altered until it becomes final urine. The filtering happens in the capillary bed called the glomerulus, and then the initial fluid that leaks out of the glomerulus is modified to become final urine. Sagittal section through this kidney, the outer portion is known as the renal cortex, because the cortex is the outer portion of any organ. And then you have what are referred to as renal pyramids. So there's a renal pyramid, and there's a renal pyramid. It kind of looks like sections of a grapefruit, maybe. That's where the nephrons are. And so if we take a closer look at a section of these, each pyramid would have thousands upon thousands of nephrons. And here's the structure of an individual nephron. Blood would be flowing into this capillary bed called the glomerulus. As the blood flows through these tubes, it leaks fluid. Anything that's in the plasma that's small, like nutrients and electrolytes, and so sugar molecules and amino acids and electrolytes, as well as wastes like uric acid, urea, and creatinine, all filter out of the glomerulus and enter the tubule. But a lot of that stuff you don't want to lose. So as the fluid flows through this convoluted tubule, its composition is being modified by the cells to make up the walls of these tubules. In general, you're going to pull back all the good stuff. You're going to get all the nutrients back out of that fluid and any electrolytes that you want to save. All the stuff that's good, you want to pull back out of that fluid. And also, you can add stuff to the fluid that you want to get rid of faster. You can secrete more urea into that fluid than originally filtered out of the glomerulus. You can secrete breakdown products of antibiotics into the fluid. So you're changing the composition of that fluid as it flows through this tubule. The last part of the tubule is called the collecting duct. And that's really where you make the final decision, or the kidney makes the final decision on how concentrated that urine's going to be. And then when it trips out the bottom of that collecting duct, its composition is done. It is now urine. It's finished. Tips of the collecting ducts are all down here, and it drips into these funnels. Drip, drip, drip into these funnels, and these funnels lead together into this region of the kidney that's called the renal pelvis. This is called the renal pelvis, and that drains into the ureter. So again, as the urine drips out of the collecting ducts, funneled down into the ureter, which leads to the bladder leads to the urethra, and on out of the body. So let's look at some more parts here. Glomerulo, of course, refers to that capillary bed. Glomerulopathy is a disease of those capillary beds. And again, you have millions of them. Glomerulonephritis would be an inflammation of the nephrons, the tubes, as well as the glomerulus. Nephro and reno both refer to kidney in general. So this is the study of the kidney. It's nephrology. A nephritis would be an inflammation of the kidney, or somebody who's going into renal failure. Their kidneys are shutting down and no longer functioning properly. Pyelo. Don't get this confused with just the pie. P-Y means pus, but pyelo means renal pelvis. It's part of that funneling into the ureter. A pyelonephritis would be an inflammation of both the kidney and the renal pelvis. Pyelitis would be an inflammation of just the renal pelvis. Both uro and urino, of course, refer to urine. So urology is the study of urine, and hematuria would be blood present in the urine, a condition of bloody urine. Litho, again, refers to stone. We saw that in both the gallbladder and the pancreas and the aorta. We saw stones forming all over the place. Lithiasis just means the presence of stones. Lithotripsy means breaking up of the stones. There's a lot of different methods of lithotripsy that you'll come across in this chapter. Again, cysto means bladder, in this context, urinary bladder, but so does vesico. Vesico, and it's going to be similar to another term that we use for the male reproductive system. And when we get to that term, I'll make the difference. But cysto and vesico both mean bladder, and in this context, urinary bladder. A cystotomy, an incision into the bladder. Cystitis, an inflammation of the bladder. Vesicotomy would be an incision into the bladder as well. Urethro refers to the urethra, that tube from the bladder to the outside world. A urethrostenosis would be a narrowing of the urethra. Urethritis would be an inflammation of that urethra. Uretero, which is kind of hard to say, uretero refers to the ureter, which brings the urine from the kidney to the bladder. So a ureterocele is a condition where the ureter is bulging into some other tissue. Ureterectomy would be a removal of that ureter. A meato is an opening. So in this case, it's the opening of the urethra to the outside world. So meatoscope would be a device to look at that opening. A meatal stenosis would be a narrowing of the opening of the urethra to the outside world. But again, meato just means an opening, so it can refer to other openings in other places. But in this context, it would be the opening of the urethra. On to the reproductive system. So the main function of the male reproductive system is to create the male gametes, the sperm, and then deliver them to the female gamete, or the ovum, the egg. When a sperm meets the egg, the two fuse together, that's called fertilization, and creates a zygote. So this is what it looks like. We can start down here in the testes, which sit inside the scrotum. That's the main site of sperm production as well as hormone production for all of the androgens, the male hormones. The sperm are created and then move into this tightly coiled tube. We'll get a better look at it in a minute, called the epididymis, which is really just fun to say. Epididymis. And there the sperm will mature, become motile, really become movable, but they'll still hang out until they're called upon. And when called upon to move out of the body, they will move down into this tube, which is called the vas deferens, although now we often refer to it as the ductus deferens, which extends up around outside the pubic bone, over across the top of the urinary bladder, around to the back of the urinary bladder, where it's joined by the seminal vesicles, which it secretes some fluid that contains food for the sperm on its journey, as well as some chemicals that will help make the female reproductive tract less hostile to sperm. So it's some fluid that impacts for the road, to make the road a little smoother for the sperm and to feed the sperm in its journey. That's the end of the ductus deferens, and that tube enters the prostate gland. The section of that tube inside the prostate gland is technically called the ejaculatory duct, and that joins with the urethra, and this is where the male urinary tract and the male reproductive tract share plumbing. The sperm and the secretions from the prostate and the seminal vesicles join together in the prostate to join the urethra, and that's their mode of exit outside the body, is through the urethra. In the female, as we'll see, the female reproductive plumbing and the female urinary plumbing are completely separate. So let's take a closer look at the testes themselves, or the testicles. Inside, they're kind of divided up into wedges. They have these tubes called seminiferous tubules, and that is the site of sperm production. The cells that make up the walls of this hollow tube create the sperm. The newly formed sperm flow through that hollow tube, through this kind of network, to the epididymis. And here you can really see how tightly coiled it is. If you were to stretch the epididymis out, it'd be about a yard in length. But all coiled up, it's maybe an inch, kind of hanging off the side of the testicle here. And that's really where the newly formed sperm is going to mature and hang out until it's called into service. And then it will flow down into this vas deferens or ductus deferens. While we're here, the term vasectomy literally means to remove the vas deferens, but they don't. What they do is they make an incision into the scrotum and then cut the vas deferens and fold back the two pieces and tie them off so that sperm can no longer get from the site of production out of the body. The farthest they could get is to where this was severed. On to other terms for the male reproductive system. Balano refers to the penis. So balanoria would be a flow from the penis, but it's an abnormal flow. It's not a flow of urine or a flow of seminal fluid. It's an unusual flow. Balanitis would be an inflammation of the penis, but again, this is an inflammation. It's not an erection. That's a very different thing. Epididymo refers to the epididymis, and some also my favorite words, epididymotomy. 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 It's just so much fun to say. That would, of course, be an incision into the epididymis, or you could have an epididymectomy, 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 a removal of the epididymis. This is also fun. Orcho, orchio, orchido, testo, and testiculo all refer to the testes or testicles. In fact, these are Greek. Orcho, orchi, and orchido are all Greek for testicle. And that's the origin of the word. I believe these other two are Latin. So you could have an orchitis, or an orchiopexy, or anorchidism. Anorchidism would be a lack of testes. This is an inflammation of the testes, surgical repair of the testes, another inflammation of the testes, just a different way of saying it. You may be familiar with the flower called orchids. They got their name from testes because the bulbs of these orchids, somebody thought they looked like testes. And so the flower is actually named after the testicles. The testicles aren't named after the flower. Prostato is that gland that sits just underneath the male bladder and surrounds both the urethra and the ejaculatory duct and is part of the pathway for sperm. And it secretes things into the seminal fluid also to help the sperm in its journey. An inflammation of it would be a prostatitis. Prostatomegaly would be an overgrown prostate, and that can be benign or it can be cancerous. And you'll see that in some of the terminology that you have to learn for this chapter. Spermo, spermato, and spermy obviously all refer to sperm itself. Aspermia means no sperm in the ejaculate. Spermicide is a drug used to kill sperm. It's often used in conjunction with other forms of contraception. And a spermatocele then would be a bulging of the vas deferens containing sperm. Next up, the last chapter, the female reproductive system.